In this spinal cord lab, we're going to be using various horizontal digital sections of the spinal cord to help us gain a better understanding of the different tracts and nuclei that are present throughout. So we'll first begin by looking at the very basic organization of the spinal cord. Now remember that the spinal cord is going to be continuous with the medulla of the brainstem at the level of the foramen magnum, and it's going to extend inferiorly to the level of the first to second lumbar vertebra in adults. Now the internal structure of the spinal cord is made up of this central gray matter that kind of has the characteristic butterfly or H-shaped appearance to it. And this central gray matter can actually be broken down into an anterior horn and a posterior horn. Now notice that the posterior horn is extending all the way to the posterior surface here, where sensory information is entering through the posterior nerve roots and rootlets to get to that posterior horn. Now the anterior horn is sending off fibers that are going to be leaving as the anterior rootlets and roots. And these anterior roots and posterior roots are converging in this region as the spinal nerve, and that convergence is going to be in the location of the intervertebral foramina. One thing to note in these sections is this really large mass right here on both sides. That's our dorsal root ganglia that's housing the cell bodies of our sensory neurons. Now outside of the gray matter lies our white matter. And our white matter can be broken down into different portions as well. So the area that's lying just medial to where those anterior nerve rootlets are exiting, that's going to be our anterior white column. And the area that's kind of in between where there's the anterior rootlets are leaving and where the posterior rootlets are coming in, that's going to be our lateral white column. And then the region that's just going to be kind of in between our posterior gray horns, that's going to be our dorsal columns. Sometimes it's referred to as the posterior columns. Now also note here the presence of this very large fissure. This is our anterior median fissure, and it's going to be more prominent on the anterior side than on the posterior side. So we have a posterior median sulcus back here, but it's just not as prominent as the anterior median fissure. So that's one way to let you know that this direction is anterior and this direction is going to be posterior. So next we're going to study the gray matter. And when studying the gray matter, we just need to be aware that there are different ways to categorize the matter. So Rex laminae is one way to divide the gray matter up into different layers. And there's actually 10 Rex layers that are defined by their neuronal structure and function. And layer 1 is going to be the most posterior layer. Layers 8 and 9 are going to be in the anterior gray horns. And then layer 10 is just going to be around the area of the central canal. So that's one way that we can divide up the gray matter. We can also divide up the gray matter by different nuclei that are going to be present within it. So some of these nuclei are spanning across multiple Rex layers, and then some of them are just going to be confined to a specific Rex layer. So within the anterior gray horn, we have a large amount of multipolar motor neurons. And these alpha and gamma motor neurons are exiting through the anterior rootlets and roots to travel to innervate skeletal muscle fibers and intrafusal muscle fibers. Now one thing to mention here is that we have a gray commissure that's connecting the gray matter from each half of the spinal cord to the other half. Now the central canal is passing through the center of the gray commissure. And so it kind of breaks up this gray commissure, so we can consider the portion of the gray commissure that's posterior to the central canal as the posterior gray commissure, and that portion of gray matter that's anterior to the central canal as the anterior gray commissure. And we also have another commissure that's going to be lying just anterior to where this gray commissure is at, and even though it's not gray matter, I just feel like it's appropriate to mention it here, and that's our anterior white commissure. So next we're going to look at the posterior gray horn. Now within the posterior gray horn we have sensory fibers that are entering the spinal cord on this posterior surface. Now some of these fibers are going to enter this posterior or dorsal column. As soon as they enter through that posterior horn, they can just travel to these dorsal columns and ascend from there. Some of these fibers are going to travel to specific nuclei within the posterior horns and synapse there. And then some of the fibers can enter a tract that's referred to as Lasauer's tract, which can ascend or descend just for a few spinal segments before they actually leave to synapse on some of these posterior horn nuclei. So anterior to the Lasauer tract is the substantia gelatinosa group, and this is going to be situated more or less at the apex of the actual posterior gray matter itself. And this is going to remain in this location throughout the entire length of the spinal cord. Now, the substantia gelatinosa is receiving fibers that are concerned with pain, temperature, and some touch as well. The nucleus proprius is another nucleus that we're looking at, and it's lying just anterior to where the substantia gelatinosa is, and it's going to be throughout the entire length of the spinal cord as well. And it's receiving fibers that are concerned with proprioception and touch, and possibly some pain fibers as well. Now the Clark's nucleus is also called the nucleus dorsalis, and it's going to be located at the base of the posterior horn. And it's not going to be present until we get to about the 8th cervical segment, and then it's just going to extend inferiorly down to the 3rd to 4th lumbar segment. This nucleus is receiving fibers that are concerned mainly with proprioception. Now the last segment of gray matter that we're going to be talking about is the lateral gray horn. Now the lateral gray horn is actually only present from spinal levels T1 to L2. And so you're only going to see this little projection coming off what looks like the lateral surface of the anterior horn. You're only going to see that from levels T1 to L2. And within this lateral gray horn lies the intermediolateral nucleus. Now this nucleus is going to be involved with the sympathetic division of the autonomic motor system. Next, we're going to look at the tracts that are present within the white matter, starting off with the anterior white column. So remember that the anterior white column is going to be located in this position, roughly anterior and medial, wrapping around medial to where the anterior gray horns are located. So the first tract that we're going to look at is the anterior spinothalamic tract, which is part of what we consider the anterior lateral system that kind of extends from this anterior white column and projects all the way into the lateral column. So the anterior spinothalamic tract is carrying information that's concerned with crude touch and pressure sensations from the body. It's going to be carrying these sensations all the way up to the level of the thalamus. So those fibers are entering the posterior horn, and some of these fibers may enter this Lasauer's tract right here to ascend or descend for a couple spinal segments before going to some of these posterior horn nuclei to synapse. So these posterior horn nuclei could be the substantia gelatinosa or the nucleus proprius. And so once they synapse, second order neurons are going to be leaving these nuclei to decussate and travel to the contralateral spinal cord to ascend as the anterior spinothalamic tract all the way up to the level of the thalamus. Next, we'll look at the vestibulospinal tract. Now these fibers are originating in the vestibular nuclei within kind of dispersed between the pons and medulla. They're going to travel down the ipsilateral spinal cord in this location anterior to the anterior gray horns. So once these descending fibers are within this tract, they can actually leave the tract to terminate by synapsing on some of these anterior horn motor nuclei. Now the anterior corticospinal tracts are going to be located in the most anterior and medial position of the spinal cord, and they're going to be located on either side of this anterior median fissure here. So this is a really good landmark to have. So these are descending motor fibers that will terminate by synapsing on some of these neurons in the anterior gray horn. So they can leave this tract and synapse on neurons within the anterior gray horn. Next, we're going to look at the tectospinal tracts. So anytime you see the word tectum in it, you should be thinking of midbrain, because that's the tectum is part of the midbrain. So the tectospinal tracts are going to be located anteriorly, somewhat sandwiched in between where the anterior corticospinal tract was and the vestibulospinal tract was as well. So it contains fibers that originated in the superior colliculus of the tectum of the midbrain. From there, fibers were going to decussate and descend to the contralateral spinal cord in this position. Now these descending fibers can once again leave the tract to terminate on some neurons that are going to be within this anterior gray horn. Next, we'll look at the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Now, the MLF is located anterior to the central canal and gray commissure, and it can influence neurons that are within the anterior gray horn as well once it leaves that tract. So now we're going to look at the posterior or dorsal white column. So remember that the dorsal white column was going to be located back in this position, kind of sandwiched in between where the posterior gray horns were located. So in this section, we have two sets of tracts that are present. More medial lies the fasciculus gracilis or gracile tracts that are carrying proprioceptive, fine touch, and vibration sensations from the lower extremity. And these fibers are entering the posterior horn. They're not synapsing quite yet, and these fibers are just going to travel to this dorsal column, this gracile tract, and ascend all the way up to the level of the medulla, where it's going to reach some specific gracile nuclei before they decussate and then ascend all the way up to the thalamus. So more lateral to the gracile tracts, we have the cuneate tracts. And these are carrying those same exact sensations except from the level of the upper extremity. And they have the same path, so these fibers are entering the posterior horn and then entering into the cuneate tracts, ascending up to the level of the medulla, where they're going to get to their own specific cuneate nuclei before they decussate and ascend all the way up to the thalamus. Since these cuneate tracts are carrying information concerning the upper extremity, they're only going to be found at the level of T6 and above. So below T6, we're not going to see these cuneate tracts, we're only going to see the gracile tracts. So last, we're going to look at our lateral white column tracts, which are located in this position. And the first tract that we're going to look at is the lateral corticospinal tract, which takes up a very large portion of this lateral white column. And the lateral corticospinal tracts contain descending upper motor neuron fibers that originated in the motor cortex, traveled down to the level of the medulla and the brainstem before they decussated to travel down the contralateral spinal cord in this position. And fibers from this lateral corticospinal tract can leave the tract to terminate by synapsing on some of these lower motor neurons to influence the activity of these lower motor neurons. So lying just anterior and somewhat overlapping with this lateral corticospinal tract is going to be the rubrospinal tract. So the rubrospinal tract originated in the red nucleus of the midbrain. From there, it was going to decussate and descend down the contralateral side in this position. And once again, fibers can leave this tract to terminate by synapsing on lower motor neurons that are going to be located within this anterior gray horn. Now the dorsospinocerebellar tract is located in the most lateral portion of this lateral white column, and these are ascending tracts that are carrying proprioceptive information mainly from the lower extremities. So these fibers are going to enter the posterior horn. They're going to synapse on Clark's nucleus, which is in this region, and from there they're going to second order neurons are going to travel to this dorsal spinocerebellar tract and travel on the ipsilateral side all the way up to the level of the cerebellum. So lying just anterior to that dorsal spinocerebellar tract is going to be the ventral or anterior spinocerebellar tract. So the ventral spinocerebellar tract is also ascending tracts that are carrying proprioceptive information from both the lower and the upper extremities. So these fibers are entering the posterior horn. Once again, they're going to synapse on Clark's nucleus, and potentially some smaller nuclei that are located in that region. And from there, these second order neurons are going to decussate to this region and ascend as the ventral spinocerebellar tract all the way up to the level of the cerebellum. And finally, we have the remainder of this anterior lateral system. So we already looked at the anterior spinothalamic tract that's part of this system as it's extended into the anterior white column. Now we're just looking mainly at the lateral column portion. So within this lateral column portion, we have the lateral spinothalamic tracts, the spinal hypothalamic tracts, the spinal reticular tracts, spinal tectal tracts, spinal olivary tracts as well. So these tracts are so squished together into this region that it's going to be very difficult to pick them apart in these sections. So we just need to refer to this entire region as the anterior lateral system. Okay, so we're going to end this review on this one last thought. So although the basic layout of the spinal cord is continuous all throughout with that same central gray matter surrounded by that external white matter, we can see some major differences by looking at the spinal cord at different spinal levels. So if we look in the cervical spinal region, over here, we can see that the anterior gray horns are huge in this case. And they're huge because it's packed with these motor neurons that are going to be leaving to supply the upper extremity. Okay, so one thing to notice here is that we've got our 4 dorsal column tracts here, so our set of cuneate tracts, more lateral, and our set of gracile tracts, more medial. So if we look at the level of the thoracic region, and this is going to be at our T2 spinal level, the thoracic region has a smaller amount of gray matter and a very narrow ventral or anterior horn compared to the cervical region. The gracile and cuneate tracts are present in this region, but the cuneate tracts once again are only going to be present from the levels of T6 and above. Below the T6 region, only the gracile tracts are going to be present. Also, within the thoracic region, the entire thoracic region, from levels T1 all the way to L2, we're going to have our lateral horns present. So anytime you see a lateral horn, you know that you're going to be in the level of the thoracic region or the lower lumbar region. And then if we look at our lumbar and sacral regions of the spinal cord, we can see that they contain a very large amount of gray matter in the posterior horn and in the anterior horns. And remember, a large amount in the anterior horns because at this level, this is our lumbosacral enlargement, and all these motor neuron fibers are going to be leaving to supply the lower extremity. And one thing to notice here is that we do not have our 4 sets of dorsal column tracts. We only have our gracile tracts in this location, carrying that proprioceptive vibration and fine touch sensations from the lower extremities. Okay, so that completes our review of the spinal cord.